So we started Unit 4 this week, and if you have been in school this week, then you probably got to cover some of this in class, and if not, hopefully this video will sum up some of the things that you've been working on during the week. So in Unit 4, there's two questions that we really want to focus on, and we'll come back to these questions during the unit and at the end of the unit and try to answer them. And we want to know what the new American identity that's been forged by the mid-1800s is. So what does it mean to be an American? And we really start to see American identity emerge during this time period because it's after the Revolutionary War, the country's been established and things like that. And the second question is, how do beliefs about democracy and freedom change in the United States during this period? We're going to see questions about who has the right to vote. The women's rights movement will start, and we'll also see the abolitionist movement come that will bring into question freedom and slavery and things like that. And so we're going to seek to answer these questions in this unit. So we'll start with the Revolution of 1800. Remember in 1796 that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson reigned for president, and Adams defeated Jefferson. And then in 1800, we're going to have basically a rematch. So Jefferson this time will defeat Adams. And we call it a revolution because we're going to see a transfer of power from the Federalist Party with Adams to the Democratic Republican Party with Jefferson. But what happens is a constitutional crisis emerges with this election. So if you remember how the loser typically became vice president, and then you learned in the crash course video that Aaron Burr, through the House of Representatives, became Jefferson's vice president. And so after the election of 1800, the 12th Amendment was added to the Constitution, which now allows us to vote for a president who has chosen a running mate as their vice president instead of whoever comes in first as president and second place as vice president, because we realized that didn't really work too well. This will also help to lead to the Hamilton-Burr duel, which we will talk about later this week. And we know that Burr will shoot and kill Hamilton. So Adams accepted defeat, and this will establish the precedent of a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another party. And while this doesn't seem like that big of a deal to us now, back then this was a huge deal because in France, the French Revolution had been occurring, and when we saw transfers of power, we saw people getting their heads chopped off via guillotine. And so for the United States to peacefully transfer power in this time period was a really big deal. And then we've continued to do that throughout our history, that if a Democrat is in power, like Barack Obama, when he stepped down and Trump became president, there were some protests and things like that, but it was peaceful. No one was getting killed. No one was having their heads chopped off. So Jefferson comes to power. His inaugural address was really conciliatory towards his opponents. So he wants to be able to work with them. He's not like, haha, I won and you lost. But he does want to dismantle as much of the Federalist system as possible. So Adams had been a Federalist. Hamilton had created his financial plan, which created the national bank and raised taxes and things like that. And Jefferson wants to dismantle that. However, he is going to be stopped from doing that in a lot of ways because of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court had mainly Federalist judges on it because our first two presidents had been Federalists, and we know that justices serve for life. And so the power of judicial review will be created during Jefferson's administration through John Marshall. Hopefully you learned about this in your Nearpod activity. But the Marshall Court will establish the court's power to review laws of Congress and the states. So judicial review allows the court to determine if a law is constitutional or not. Typically, we just assume this was a power the court had via the Constitution, but it wasn't. The court actually gets this power through the Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison. So John Marshall, he had actually been Secretary of State under John Adams, but he gets appointed to the Supreme Court. He's the longest Chief Justice, the longest serving Chief Justice in U.S. history. He'll be on the court until around 1835. And in his cases, he's going to constantly argue the supremacy of the federal government. So because Marshall is a Federalist, in all of his cases, he's going to say that the Constitution is the law of the land, that federal laws are going to be supreme over state laws. And that's going to cause him to clash with Thomas Jefferson quite a bit because Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. So when we talk about foreign policy in Jefferson's presidency, one of the main things he has to deal with is Napoleon Bonaparte, who had came to power in France and then basically became a dictator in France. And in the Napoleonic Wars, he's going to conquer much of Europe. You can see here, he conquered Italy, Spain, Portugal, what's today Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium. And so he's building this French empire. He even tried to invade Russia, but it's really cold in the winter, so he had to turn around. And so what happened was Napoleon owned this Louisiana territory. Jefferson was only interested in buying New Orleans because New Orleans was a huge port city. It was right at the end of the Mississippi River, right on the Gulf Coast, so it was perfect for trade. But when he approaches Napoleon, Napoleon offers to sell him all of the land because Napoleon needs the money to help fight the Napoleonic Wars. But the Louisiana Purchase created a dilemma for Jefferson. So Jefferson was a strict constructionist because remember he had been anti-federalist. So he didn't feel like that the Constitution gave him the power to buy this land. He thought that he was limited to the power specifically given in the Constitution. But Jefferson realizes this was a good deal. It's kind of like when something's on sale and you just got to buy it. But he also knew that New Orleans would be a great trade asset for the United States. So he's going to justify what he feels like is an overreach of the Constitution by arguing that this land is going to help secure the country economically and help his vision of having a country that's based on agriculture. And the Federalists are going to oppose this. And so you'll be reading letters by Federalists who oppose Jefferson's purchase of Louisiana. So the Louisiana Purchase offers all of this territory. We know that he sends Lewis and Clark out to explore this, basically doubles the size of the United States, and then New Orleans here is what Jefferson was initially concerned with getting. So this will create eventually 15 new states in the country, and it will also later on raise issues over the spread of slavery. So Lewis and Clark will go out, and their object is both scientific and commercial to explore this land. Jefferson was really big into science and learning about nature and things like that, and so Lewis and Clark will send him back a lot of specimens from their journey as well. And so they're going to bring invaluable information back to Jefferson about the layout of the land and things like that. So once Louisiana starts to be incorporated, especially in New Orleans, what's going to happen is Louisiana slaves are going to actually lose freedom when they come under the control of the United States. So if you remember, originally that land had belonged to Spain. They had actually gotten it after the French and Indian War. Napoleon took it back when he invaded Spain. But slaves in New Orleans had a lot more freedom under the Spanish and the French empires than they will under the United States. Even though we were supposed to be the land of the free and all men were created equal and things like that, they're actually going to lose some of their rights. So Hamilton and Burr also get into a duel. Burr was Jefferson's vice president. So the vice president of the United States is going to shoot and kill Alexander Hamilton. And you'll be listening to some songs about this that kind of help explain it. But Hamilton was running for a political position in New York, and Burr and Hamilton had been at odds with each other for a number of years. They had fought together in the Revolution and had kind of been competitors with one another. And even after the Revolution, they were both lawyers in New York and things like that. And they really hate each other. And back then, pride and honor was a really big deal. And so when you felt like your pride and honor were being attacked, then you would challenge someone to a duel to protect that. Typically, duels never ended up in people shooting each other. So typically you sent out your second, which was someone who went with you. They were kind of like your mediator, and your seconds would go out, and they would typically strike a deal that no one would end up going 10 paces and then shooting and firing. But what happens with Burr and Hamilton, they're not able to come to an agreement, and Burr will shoot Hamilton. Hamilton will die the next day. Burr is never convicted or charged with murder. He actually flees to Mexico and stays there for a while. He was literally vice president when this happens, which is just mind-blowing. But the death of Hamilton, people will mourn Hamilton. Even people who disagreed with him, like Thomas Jefferson, will acknowledge the things that he did to help the United States and build up the treasury and things like that. And Burr kind of becomes this villain in history, even though Burr felt like he was just trying to protect his own life. hopefully you've watched the Hamilton musical because it helps explain all of that in a little bit more detail. But we'll listen to some of the songs from Hamilton about that. So Jefferson does also have some problems abroad in the second term of his presidency. Remember, he's president from 1804 to 1808. And the wars that were happening in Europe, specifically the Napoleonic Wars, are directly affecting American farmers and merchants and things like that. Jefferson doesn't want to get involved in the war, but he does want to help the American economy. And Jefferson's going to place an embargo, which means he's going to ban American ships from going to foreign ports. And he's hoping that by doing this, it will allow the countries to stop involving the U.S. Navy in wars. This actually backfires and hurts American trade more than it helps Britain and France. Remember, America was a really new country, and Britain and France had been around for a while. And the British were also impressing American soldiers and sailors, and it talked about this in the crash course video that you watched. Basically, Great Britain needed more soldiers to fight against Napoleon, and their argument was that the Americans were still technically part of the British Empire, so they would kidnap them and impress them or force them to fight in the British Navy. This is something that England will continue to do, and it'll be one of the leading causes of the War of 1812. And so the Embargo Act is a huge failure. It cripples the American economy, and Jefferson has to rescind it. And so that's one of the things that happens in the second term of his presidency as well. Okay, so that's basically Jefferson's presidency. I will post these songs tomorrow that you're going to listen to as kind of your check-in on Friday to learn a little bit more about the Burr-Hamilton duel. And I do encourage you, if you have Disney Plus, to watch the Hamilton musical because it really puts into perspective the life of Hamilton, and especially in the second part really shows the animosity and the political divisions between Jefferson and Hamilton.